The car keys were gone again. I noticed it the way I'd learned to notice everything in that house quietly, without reaction, filing it away like a document I wasn't supposed to have seen. The hook by the back door held my husband's keys, his spare set, and the little brass keychain his mother had given him 40 years ago. Mine were not there. They hadn't been there since Tuesday. When Gerald came in from the garage that evening, I was at the stove making his dinner. Beef stew, the way he liked it, with the pearl onions he'd special ordered from the IGA in town. I didn't ask about the keys. I already knew what he'd say. "You never need to go anywhere that I don't take you. We live in the middle of nowhere, Eleanor. What would you do with the car?" He wasn't wrong about the location. Millbrook, Ontario is the kind of town where everyone knows which driveway belongs to which family, where the coffee shop on King Street has had the same owner for 31 years, and where a woman crying in a parking lot would be noticed by someone who knew her husband. That last part, I had come to understand, was exactly why Gerald had chosen to retire here. We'd moved from Mississauga 6 years ago, when he took early retirement from the insurance company where he'd spent 3 decades managing other people's risk. I thought it would be an adventure. A slower pace, a vegetable garden. Maybe grandchildren visiting in the summers, though our daughter Marlene lived in Vancouver and made no promises. Instead, what Millbrook gave Gerald was control over everything I did, wrapped in the reasonable language of small-town simplicity. It hadn't started with the car keys. It never starts with something that obvious. It started with the joint account. We'd always had separate finances. My nursing pension from 32 years at Credit Valley Hospital, his corporate plan, and a joint account for household expenses. Sensible. Adult. The way two people who respected each other arranged things. Then Gerald retired, and within 8 months he'd suggested, very reasonably, that it made more sense to consolidate everything. Less paperwork. Easier to track. He'd set it all up and I could focus on other things. I was 63 years old and I signed the papers he put in front of me because I trusted him. Because we'd been married for 39 years and I was tired from my last year of shifts and I thought retirement meant rest. What it meant was that Gerald now had full visibility into every dollar I spent, and I had no account of my own. He transferred a weekly household allowance into a secondary account attached to his $200 a week for groceries, pharmacy, and what he called personal items. If I needed more, I had to ask. If I'd spent on something he hadn't approved, there would be a conversation at the kitchen table that felt less like a conversation and more like a performance review. $47 at the drugstore. What did you buy? Show me the receipt. We have Tylenol already. This brand costs twice as much. $62 at the bookstore in Peterborough. Eleanor, we have a library. Is this really the best use of our budget? Our budget. As though it weren't also my pension arriving on the 15th of every month, folded invisibly into his accounts. I stopped going to the bookstore. I stopped having lunch with my former colleague Dorothy, who'd driven up from Brampton twice, and eventually stopped calling when I kept canceling. I stopped attending the Millbrook Women's Institute meetings I'd joined in our first year, because attending required gas money I'd have to account for, and because Gerald had started making comments about what kind of women joined groups like that. He didn't forbid anything outright. That wasn't his style. He simply made everything not worth the effort. The car keys disappeared in stages too. First, he started tracking the odometer. Then he began scheduling my errands so he could drive me himself. By winter of my second year in Millbrook, I was asking permission to take the car to the pharmacy 2 kilometers away, and somehow I had agreed to this. Somehow it had happened so gradually, I couldn't identify the moment it became my life. Gerald had the car for his Saturday curling in Lindsay and his Tuesday lunch with the retired men's group at the Royal Canadian Legion. Those 2 windows, never more than 2.5 hours, were the only time I was ever alone in that house. I had not spoken to Marlene in 4 months. Gerald answered when she called and told her I was napping, or out walking, or in the bath. He'd mentioned once, in his reasonable way, that Marlene stirred me up emotionally, that our relationship had always been complicated, and that maybe some distance would be good for both of us. He said it the way he said everything, not as a command but as a clinical observation. I repeated it to myself so many times I started to believe it. The morning everything changed was a Thursday in February. The temperature in Millbrook had dropped to -20 with the wind chill, and I needed to get to the Shoppers Drug Mart on King Street to pick up a prescription for my blood pressure medication. Gerald had the car. He'd driven to Lindsay for a hockey game with his former colleague Wayne, and he wouldn't be back until 4. He'd left me cab fare, a $20 bill placed on the counter with the instruction to take Millbrook taxi and keep the receipt. I called the taxi. I waited 20 minutes in the cold outside our front door because the driveway was icy, and Gerald had mentioned twice that he didn't want the door opening and closing and letting the cold air into the front hall. The driver who came was a young man named Kevin who'd grown up in Millbrook and recognized me from the pharmacy where his aunt worked. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He looked at me in the rearview mirror and I realized I was gripping the $20 bill with both hands like it might be taken from me. At Shoppers, I paid for my prescription, which came to $14.80. That left me $5.20 from Gerald's $20. I needed shampoo. I needed new diabetic socks, which my doctor had told me at my last appointment were non-negotiable. I stood in the personal care aisle for a long time, doing the math that had become the background noise of my days, and I understood that I couldn't buy both. I put the shampoo in my basket and looked at the socks and put them back. The woman beside me reached past me to get something from the lower shelf and glanced up. She was around my age, maybe a few years younger, with silver hair cut short and the kind of calm, unhurried face that made me think she'd spent a long time listening to people. She looked at my basket. She looked at my hands. She looked at my face. I don't know what she saw there, but she straightened up and didn't move away. "My name is Judith," she said. "Judith Halverson. I'm a social worker with Halliburton Kawartha Pine Ridge." She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a card. "I want you to have this. The number on the back is my direct line. I don't need," I started. She shook her head gently, not dismissing me but steady, certain. "Keep it. That's all I'm asking." I bought the shampoo. I did not buy the socks. I took Kevin's taxi back to the house and sat in the front hall until I'd stopped shaking. Then I went to the kitchen and put Judith's card inside the back cover of my old copy of The Stone Angel, the Margaret Lawrence novel I'd carried since nursing school. Gerald had never opened it. He didn't read what he called women's books. That night I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe, and I thought about the socks. Not about leaving, not yet. Just about the socks. I called Judith's number from the payphone at the Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks later while Gerald was at the Legion. My hands were cold. I hadn't dressed for standing outside, and I couldn't go inside the Tim Hortons because someone might see me and mention it to Gerald, who had a way of knowing things I couldn't account for. Judith answered on the second ring, as though she'd been expecting me. She met me the following Tuesday at the Northumberland Family Resource Center in Coburg, close enough to Millbrook that I could manage it if I had a reason to be in the area, far enough that no one Gerald knew would see me walk in. I told Gerald I had a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist. I'd had a minor arrhythmia scare the previous fall, and he still believed I needed regular monitoring. He dropped me at the hospital entrance, parked his car, and went to the Tim Hortons across the street to read the Globe and Mail. I walked through the hospital, out the rear exit, and took a city bus 4 blocks to the resource center. The waiting room was warm and painted a soft coral color that shouldn't have worked but did. A mural of the Northumberland Hills ran along one wall, done by local children, their uneven brushstrokes making the landscape look more alive than a photograph would have. Judith came out and shook my hand. Not a social worker's handshake, careful and professional, but the handshake of someone who meant it. We sat in her office for an hour, then an hour more. She had a kettle and a box of red rose tea, and she let me talk until I'd said everything. 39 years of marriage, 6 years in Millbrook. The accounts, the car keys, the $200 a week, the canceled lunches, the unanswered calls from my daughter. The socks I couldn't buy. The phone Gerald answered when Marlene called. Judith didn't say "I'm so sorry" or "that must be terrible." She said what you're describing has a name: financial abuse, coercive control. And she said it the way a doctor names something that's been hurting you for years, with authority and without drama, because naming it is the first step to treating it. I started crying. I hadn't cried in a long time. Gerald didn't like crying, he called it manipulative, and I had internalized that so completely I'd stopped knowing how. "Can you leave?" Judith asked. The automatic answer came, "I can't. I don't have access to money. My daughter doesn't know what's been happening. I haven't spoken to my sister in 2 years. I don't drive in the winter." And then Judith said, "Those are obstacles. They're not walls. There's a difference. We met every Tuesday for 7 weeks. Gerald never questioned the cardiologist visits. He dropped me at the hospital and picked me up 90 minutes later, and in the car home asked how the appointment went. "Good," I said. "They're monitoring it." He nodded and turned the radio to the news. The plan we built took time, patience, and a precision I hadn't used since my nursing years, when I was managing 12 patients on a ward and knew without looking which one needed intervention before they showed a single symptom. First, documents. This was the hardest part. Gerald kept everything: our wills, the deed to the house, my OAS information, bank records, my nursing pension statements in a locked filing cabinet in his study. He kept the key on his keychain, with the car keys and the Legion card. The keychain never left his person except when he showered. On shower mornings, I watched from the hallway until I heard the water run. Then I took the key from the kitchen counter where he laid it. I had 30 seconds, sometimes 40. The first Tuesday, I just located the cabinet drawer. The second Tuesday, I opened it and memorized the categories. The third Tuesday, I took everything I needed and carried it to the Coburg Library on my bus ride, copied it all, and had the originals back in the cabinet before Gerald turned the shower off. My hands remembered how to be steady. 32 years of nursing teaches you that. Judith connected me with a family lawyer named Sandra Okonkwo, who worked with the Resource Center on a reduced-fee basis for women in financial abuse situations. Sandra was 41, matter of fact, and had the kind of measured calm that made difficult things seem survivable. She explained my rights under Ontario family law in terms I could hold on to. After 39 years of marriage, I had an equalization claim on all family property acquired during the marriage: Gerald's pension, our savings, the Millbrook house under the Family Law Act. I was entitled to half the net value of everything. I hadn't known that. Gerald had told me once, years ago, that his pension was his contribution and my pension was mine, and that's how the math worked. It was one of many things he'd said with such confidence that I'd stopped questioning it. I also learned I could apply for a temporary support order to cover living expenses during the separation period. Sandra had done this before, many times. She knew what to expect, and she knew how to document it. "We need evidence of the control," she said. "Bank statements showing the $200 transfers. Your texts asking him for additional money. Any emails. The more documentation, the better." I had 7 months of weekly $200 transfers that Gerald had set up automatically, each one time-stamped, all of them going into the secondary account he'd created for what he called household management. I had texts on my phone asking him for $40 for the pharmacy, asking for $80 when the grocery bill ran over. Each time he'd replied with a question: "What for? Can it wait? Is that necessary?" Sandra photographed everything. Judith found me a place to go. Her colleague ran a transitional housing program through a women's organization in Coburg. Not a shelter, she explained, more like a private home with 2 spare rooms for women in situations like mine. The woman's name was Frances. She was 72, a retired teacher, and she had a spare room with a window that looked out on her backyard bird feeders. The arrangement was informal and safe. Frances asked no questions and offered no unsolicited advice. She simply made sure the second bathroom had fresh towels and that there was always something warm on the stove. I started preparing 3 weeks before I left. In the evenings, while Gerald watched the news, I moved things slowly. A cardigan, a pair of shoes, my mother's opal ring that I'd kept in my winter boot for years because Gerald had once made a comment about the cost of jewelry, my nursing pin, the photo from Marlene's university graduation that had always lived in my nightstand drawer. I used a canvas shopping bag from the Coburg Farmers Market, the kind that gets taken in and out of the house without comment. Each Tuesday I brought something out. Each Tuesday I left something in Frances's spare room. The thing I hadn't planned was how calm I would feel. I thought I would be frightened. I'd been frightened for so long in small, quiet ways that I assumed leaving would feel like the worst of it. Instead, as the date got closer, I felt something I didn't have a word for at first. It took me a week to recognize it as clearness, the way the air feels the morning after a long storm. We picked a Saturday. Gerald played curling in Lindsay every Saturday from 9 until 1 and occasionally stayed for lunch, which made it closer to 2. Sandra had filed the separation papers the Thursday before. They would be served to Gerald at the Millbrook house, but I would not be there. The Friday night, I made him supper as I always did. Roast chicken, roasted carrots, his mother's gravy recipe that he'd given me when we were first married. He ate without comment. He watched the hockey game. I did the dishes and went to bed early, which he didn't notice because he rarely came to bed before I was asleep. I lay in the dark thinking about Marlene. Judith had reached out to her through a contact carefully, without giving Gerald anything to use. Marlene had called the resource center in tears. She said she'd been trying to reach me for over a year. She'd sent letters to Marlene's old Mississauga address and didn't understand why I hadn't replied. She hadn't known Gerald had arranged for our mail forwarding and had been collecting it himself. She knew now. Saturday morning, I made Gerald's breakfast. Oatmeal with maple syrup and a cup of red rose from the box I'd started buying for myself, because small things matter. He ate and read the paper on his tablet and told me the roads might be icy, so I shouldn't plan to go anywhere. I said I wouldn't. He left at 8:52. I watched his car back out of the driveway. I waited 5 minutes. Then I picked up my coat, my purse, and the canvas bag I'd left by the back door, and I walked through the house one last time, the kitchen with its too many rules. The front hall with its hook where my car keys had stopped living. The bedroom that had felt less and less like a room I shared with someone and more like a room I was permitted to use. I didn't leave a note. Sandra had told me not to. Don't explain yourself. He'll use it, just go. Francis's neighbor Carol was waiting at the end of our road in her Subaru. She was 67, a retired school principal, and she'd agreed to drive me without being told the details. Some women, Judith had said, just understand. Carol had the heat on and a travel mug of tea ready in the cup holder, and she didn't say a single word until we were through Millbrook and onto the highway, and then she said, "Clear morning." It was a clear morning. Gerald called my cell phone 31 times that afternoon. I knew this because Judith told me later I had left the phone behind deliberately, because Sandra had advised it, and because I did not want to hear his voice in the moment when I was first learning what silence felt like. He called the curling club and asked if anyone had seen me. He called the Millbrook Pharmacy. He called the Coburg Hospital and told them his wife was missing and he was worried about her heart condition. A duty nurse who happened to know Judith made a note and called the resource center. Gerald eventually called the OPP, who conducted a wellness check, found no evidence of harm, and were informed by Sandra that I had left voluntarily and that a separation had been legally filed. According to Sandra, Gerald told the officer someone had put me up to this, that I wasn't well, that I had never been good at understanding financial matters, and that anyone who'd suggested otherwise had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. The officer apparently did not find this persuasive. The legal process in Ontario moved slowly, as it always does. Gerald contested the equalization claim, disputed the valuation of his pension, and argued I had no basis for a support claim since I had my nursing pension. His lawyer sent letters that Sandra described as aggressive but not unusual. Gerald told people in Millbrook that I'd had a breakdown. He told the man at the Legion that I'd been under the influence of a bad group of women. He told his curling team that he was devastated. Sandra had the documentation, the $200 weekly transfers, the texts, my nursing pension statements showing exactly what I contributed to our household, the financial records Gerald had insisted on keeping in his own name, which now provided irrefutable proof of what he controlled. Family court in Ontario takes equalization seriously. So does spousal support law when there's a significant income disparity created by one spouse's financial control over another. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Madam Justice Osei-Bonsu, did not find Gerald's characterization of our finances persuasive. She had, Sandra told me afterward with characteristic understatement, seen similar situations before. The divorce was finalized the following December, 11 months after I'd left. I received equalization of the family property, a payment from Gerald's portion of the Millbrook house, and a share of his corporate pension that his lawyer had spent 4 months insisting was untouchable. I received spousal support until my old age security and CPP benefits reached their full amounts at 65. I received the right to reclaim my nursing pension without encumbrance. More than any of that, I received the documentation that Gerald had been intercepting Marlene's letters and phone calls for 3 years. Marlene flew to Toronto in January. We sat in Francis's warm living room while the feeders outside filled up with chickadees and nuthatches, and we talked for 6 hours. She told me about her partner, a woman named Diane, who Gerald had never approved of, which had been part of why contact was dangerous for both of us. She told me she'd been sure for years that something was wrong, that her mother wouldn't simply stop calling, and that she'd eventually stop trusting her own instincts because she had no proof, and Gerald was always so reasonable on the phone. I told her everything: the accounts, the car keys, the socks, the Margaret Lawrence novel, the payphone in the Tim Hortons parking lot. She cried. I let her. Then I cried too, and it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like the pressure finally finding somewhere to go. I'm still at Francis's. I know that's become a point of conversation, a woman my age, with my settlement, still sharing a house. But Francis and I have developed a rhythm I value. We do the crossword on Sunday mornings and argue about Clue 17. She drives me to the Coburg Farmers Market in the summer. I handle all the medical appointments, because 32 years of nursing makes me useful in situations where she's nervous, and she handles the car because I still don't drive in winter, though I've enrolled in a refresher course at the Coburg Driving School starting in March. Small steps, but mine. Last month, I started volunteering at the Northumberland Family Resource Center on Tuesday afternoons. Judith trained me herself. I sit with women who come in not knowing what they need, only knowing something is wrong, and I make tea and I listen, and then I say, "What you're describing has a name." And I say, "There's a difference between obstacles and walls." And I say, "You can leave." I know because I did. I kept the canvas shopping bag. It hangs on a hook in Francis's back hall alongside Carol's collection of reusable bags from every co-op in eastern Ontario. Mine still has the Coburg Farmers Market logo on the side, a little worn now from washing. Sometimes when I'm getting my coat, I look at it and think about what I carried in it: a cardigan, a pair of shoes, my mother's ring, my nursing pin, the photograph of my daughter at her graduation. 67 years old, and the things that mattered fit in a canvas bag. I used to think the hardest thing about leaving would be the fear. I was wrong. The hardest thing was learning that I'd been right all along, that something was wrong, that it wasn't just retirement adjustment, that I wasn't bad with money or difficult or too sensitive. The hardest thing was forgiving myself for taking so long. But then Judith said something to me on my first day of volunteer training that I've thought about every day since. She said, "The fact that you finally believed it doesn't mean you were slow. It means you were thorough. You don't take your life apart until you're sure. And when you were sure, you moved with precision." She wasn't wrong. 32 years of nursing. I knew how to wait for the right moment and then act without hesitation. I'm still learning what freedom tastes like. So far it tastes like red rose tea and Sunday crosswords, and a Tuesday afternoon with a woman who walked into a warm room not knowing she was allowed to stay. Tell her she is, that's all. Tell her she is, and wait, and make the tea, and let her find the rest herself.